It was autumn of 1997, a bright Saturday morning in Austin, Texas. Margaret Halloran watched her husband Jim buckle their 8-year-old daughter Lucia into the back seat of their shiny red Cadillac. They were heading out on a quick weekend trip through the scenic Texas hill country. Jim smiled warmly, promising Margaret they'd call from the motel that evening. As Margaret waved goodbye, she had no idea it would be the last time she'd see her family together. Hours passed quietly, with no phone call. Margaret began to sense something was terribly wrong. Sunday morning came with painful silence. Margaret repeatedly dialed their motel, only to learn Jim had checked out earlier, yet no one had heard from him since. Anxiety turned to dread. Margaret reached out to friends, family, and hospitals, but no one had any news. By evening, panic fully set in. She contacted the Austin Police Department, officially reporting Jim and Lucia missing. Officers assured her they'd investigate, yet no clues surfaced. Days turned into weeks, then months, each one deepening Margaret's grief and uncertainty. Years went by, and Margaret's life became defined by the absence of answers. She paid local TV stations annually to broadcast a missing person alert on the anniversary of Jim and Lucia's disappearance. Each year, Margaret would sit nervously on her floral-patterned sofa, holding her breath, hoping someone watching might know something, anything. But 16 painful years passed without even the smallest break. Friends moved on, family urged her to accept reality, yet Margaret held stubbornly to hope. She needed closure. Living in uncertainty was unbearable. Then, on a cool autumn morning in 2009, Margaret received an unexpected call from Officer Daniels at the Austin Police. Her heartbeat quickened as he explained a shocking discovery. A red Cadillac matching Jim's had just been located in a junkyard in San Marcos, nearly crushed by heavy machinery. Margaret could barely breathe as she agreed to accompany officers immediately. Her mother, Doris, now elderly, insisted on coming along. As the patrol car sped southward, Margaret fought back tears, hope and fear swirling painfully inside her. Arriving at the junkyard, Margaret's stomach tightened at the sight of the police and yellow crime scene tape. Detective Reyes greeted her gently, guiding her toward a twisted heap of metal. Even mangled, Margaret instantly recognized Jim's prized Cadillac. Tears stung her eyes, memories flooding back. Jim polishing the chrome, Lucia singing happily in the back seat. But now, the gleaming paint had faded, the once beloved car crushed beyond recognition. Margaret felt a physical pain, like losing Jim and Lucia all over again. Detective Reyes introduced Dean Lame, the junkyard owner. Dean nervously explained the car mysteriously appeared with no records, but an employee named Reed Caraway had brought it in. Reed claimed an older man who matched Jim's description eerily dropped the car off. Margaret's heart stopped. Her mind raced with confusion. Could Jim be alive after all these years? But why abandon the Cadillac he'd loved so much? Doris squeezed Margaret's trembling hand, sensing her daughter's turmoil, silently urging her to stay strong. Reed Caraway appeared at the junkyard soon after. He described a strange encounter. An elderly man paid cash, abandoned the Cadillac hastily, and vanished. Margaret's blood ran cold as Reed described him. Tall, slim, thick mustache, quiet voice. It sounded exactly like Jim. Margaret struggled to remain composed, overwhelmed by questions. Doris voiced disbelief. How could Jim reappear 16 years later only to discard his cherished Cadillac without contacting them? Detective Reyes promised to investigate further, sensing a deeper mystery. As police searched Reed's locked office for evidence, Doris suffered a sudden asthma attack. Margaret hurried to find her inhaler. While assisting her mother, Margaret spotted something shocking through Reed's office door. a small blue handbag on a shelf. Her breath caught. It looked identical to Lucia's favorite purse. Memories flooded back. Lucia's excitement over her Barbie bag, purchased after saving her allowance. Margaret felt sick. Why would Reed have Lucia's handbag? And why had he never mentioned having a daughter before? Margaret confronted Reed gently about the blue handbag. He casually claimed it belonged to his daughter, now living with her mother in Houston. But Doris noticed the bag's interior tag was oddly erased, as if someone had deliberately hidden identifying details. Margaret's unease deepened. Reed smoothly insisted she keep the handbag, saying it was just collecting dust. Margaret accepted hesitantly, sensing hidden danger beneath Reed's calm demeanor. She decided privately to investigate further, no longer trusting coincidences. Later that afternoon, Margaret and Doris took the handbag to a vintage collectibles expert. He confirmed their fears. The handbag was indeed a rare Barbie accessory, only produced briefly in 1983, the exact model Lucia owned. Even more troubling, someone had purposely erased the interior label using heat. Margaret realized Reed had lied. Her heartbeat quickened with dread. Why was Reed connected to both Jim's Cadillac and Lucia's purse? Margaret knew she must inform Detective Reyes immediately, sensing their lives had suddenly become dangerously entangled. Margaret hurriedly called Detective Reyes, explaining everything they'd learned about the handbag. The detective listened intently, his voice calm yet serious. He advised Margaret and Doris to immediately come to the station, urging caution and promising to investigate Reed Carraway further. Margaret felt uneasy, sensing their lives had become entangled in something deeply sinister. She gently placed the handbag into a protective bag, her hands shaking. Doris touched her arm softly, offering silent support as they prepared to leave, uncertainty looming heavily between them. As Margaret drove toward the police station, her sedan suddenly lurched, the brake warning light flashing urgently. Panicked, she managed to pull onto the roadside just as the car sputtered and died. Margaret and Doris exchanged anxious glances. This car had never failed before. Before Margaret could call for help, a familiar pickup truck slowed behind them. Reed Carraway stepped out, smiling with unsettling calmness. Margaret's pulse raced, wondering how Reed always seemed to appear at precisely the wrong moment. Reed approached casually, offering assistance as Margaret reluctantly explained the breakdown. Reed's friend Jason, a quiet, muscular man, emerged from the truck and inspected Margaret's vehicle. He quickly announced a damaged brake line, suggesting towing the car to their junkyard for repairs. Doris stiffened, clearly uncomfortable, whispering concerns to Margaret. But stranded on a quiet roadside, with daylight fading, Margaret hesitantly agreed. Reed's demeanor remained friendly, but Margaret couldn't shake a deepening sense of dread. Inside Reed's truck, Margaret nervously clutched her purse, Doris silently gripping her inhaler. Reed drove away from the main road, turning onto unfamiliar back roads. Margaret questioned the unusual route. Reed smoothly mentioned traffic avoidance. Jason sat quietly, his expression unreadable. Doris covertly texted someone, hiding the phone discreetly. Margaret's heart pounded louder with every passing mile. They were driving further from safety, further from answers. She realized too late they were heading into a terrifying trap. The truck pulled into a remote farmhouse hidden among thick trees. Panic surged through Margaret as Reed's tone turned cold. Jason produced a handgun, ordering them inside. Margaret and Doris, trembling, were marched into a dim room, handcuffed and gagged roughly. Reed's facade evaporated. His eyes now showed ruthless determination. He demanded to know exactly what Margaret knew about Lucia's disappearance, mentioning her daughter's name chillingly. Margaret's mind spun. How deeply was Reed connected to her family's nightmare? As Margaret tried processing this horror, an elderly man named Micah appeared quietly in the doorway, assigned to guard them. Reed and Jason left briefly, locking them inside with Micah. Margaret pleaded desperately, explaining Lucia's disappearance. Micah listened silently, emotions flickering behind his tired eyes. Doris softly appealed to his humanity, promising they'd help him escape this place. Something shifted in Micah's face. He finally whispered, "You're Lucia. They call her Samantha now. She's alive here." Margaret felt the room spin, her heart shattering and soaring simultaneously. Lucia, alive after 15 painful years? Micah warned them quietly, explaining Lucia had been controlled, broken by a man named Charlie Carnes, Reed's ruthless step-uncle. Carnes kept girls isolated, hidden, stripping away their identities. Micah's voice trembled, admitting shamefully he'd remained silent for years. He cautiously revealed a hidden cell phone, dialed emergency services discreetly, whispering the farmhouse's location as Margaret held her breath, hope flickering painfully inside her. The door burst open suddenly, revealing Reed, Jason, and a hulking man Margaret instinctively recognized as Charlie Carnes. His presence radiated cruelty. Carnes approached, studying Margaret with chilling curiosity. His voice dripped menace as he announced a twisted game, forcing Margaret to identify Lucia from among several captive young women. Terrified, Margaret studied their faces desperately, recognizing a small scar on one woman's eyebrow. She shakily pointed. Carnes laughed darkly, confirming Margaret's choice correct. Lucia stood motionless, eyes heartbreakingly vacant. Carnes's sadistic game escalated. He ordered Lucia to undress Margaret, asserting control. Margaret begged Lucia, trying to spark memories of their lost family. Lucia hesitated, confusion briefly flickering in her distant gaze. Just then, sirens erupted outside, chaos exploding through the farmhouse. Police stormed in, weapons drawn. Micah shielded Margaret, taking bullets intended for her as Carnes fought violently. Officers swiftly subdued Reed, Jason, and Carnes. Margaret, shaking uncontrollably, reached desperately for Lucia, whispering comfortingly as chaos subsided. Margaret and Doris reunited tearfully with Lucia at the hospital. Doctors evaluated Lucia carefully, confirming deep psychological trauma. Margaret gently reassured Lucia she was finally safe, promising unconditional love. Slowly, Lucia's eyes flickered with faint recognition, whispering remorsefully, "I'm sorry I'm broken." Margaret embraced her softly, fighting tears. Detectives later revealed chilling details. Jim was murdered the night he disappeared, Lucia held captive for years. Margaret vowed silently to help Lucia heal, determined their family's nightmare would finally find peace. At the hospital, Margaret gently stroked Lucia's hair, feeling her daughter relax for the first time since their reunion. Doctors explained Lucia's recovery would be long and complicated, warning Margaret to expect emotional setbacks. Margaret vowed silently to herself and to Lucia that they'd face every obstacle together. Doris held Lucia's other hand, whispering softly about happier days ahead. A nurse quietly informed Margaret that Micah Carraway was conscious, requesting to speak with her urgently about Jim's fate. Margaret steeled herself, preparing emotionally. Margaret entered Micah's hospital room, his pale face etched with remorse and exhaustion, his voice weak but clear. Micah confessed everything. He painfully recounted how, back in 1997, Charlie manipulated young Reed into helping abduct Lucia after murdering Jim. Charlie saw Jim's kindness as weakness, an easy target. Margaret's heart clenched painfully hearing details of Jim's final moments. Micah explained tearfully he lived in constant fear of Charlie, ashamed he'd stayed silent, lacking the courage to intervene earlier. Margaret quietly forgave him, understanding fear's devastating power. Detective Reyes arrived shortly after, informing Margaret they'd located Jim's remains exactly where Reed indicated. Margaret fought tears, thankful yet grieving anew. Jim's kindness ultimately cost him his life, but Margaret refused bitterness. Jim's compassion would remain his legacy, remembered proudly by those who loved him. Reyes also explained Reed's growing cooperation, detailing other crimes involving Charlie Carnes across multiple states. The magnitude of Charlie's horrific actions stunned Margaret, yet provided grim clarity. Lucia survived something unspeakable, yet miraculous. Days later, police allowed Margaret and Doris to return home with Lucia, now safely in her childhood bedroom. Lucia struggled initially, often withdrawn, startled by small noises, cautious of strangers. Margaret gently encouraged therapy sessions, giving Lucia space yet ensuring unconditional support. Slowly, Lucia opened emotionally, sharing small memories from captivity. Margaret's heart ached with each detail but stayed strong, committed to Lucia's healing. Doris quietly cooked Lucia's favorite childhood meals, creating comforting routines that gradually restored a sense of normalcy. 6 months passed, Lucia's progress steady yet fragile. Margaret continued regular sessions with therapists who praised Lucia's courage and resilience. One evening, as Margaret sorted old family photographs, Lucia silently joined her. Carefully, Lucia picked up a photo of Jim smiling proudly beside the red Cadillac. Margaret cautiously watched Lucia's expression soften with recognition. Lucia softly spoke of vague memories, a warm smile, a comforting voice. Margaret listened patiently, feeling hope surge. Lucia's memories, buried deeply, were finally resurfacing slowly, cautiously. Margaret arranged a small memorial service for Jim, attended by close family and trusted friends. Lucia sat quietly beside her mother and grandmother, tears flowing gently. Margaret spoke lovingly of Jim's kindness, humor, and devotion to family. Lucia listened intently, absorbing each word. Afterward, Lucia whispered softly, thanking Margaret for preserving Jim's memory. Margaret embraced her gently, promising they'd always honor Jim's life. Lucia felt comforted, finally understanding her father's love clearly for the first time since her rescue. One afternoon, Detective Reyes called Margaret, explaining Reed had requested to speak directly with her before his sentencing. Margaret hesitated, conflicted, but finally agreed. At the police station, Reed appeared transformed, quiet, humbled, eyes filled with remorse. He softly apologized, sincerely accepting responsibility, explaining his toxic upbringing under Charlie. Margaret studied Reed silently, finally understanding how deeply manipulated he'd been. She quietly forgave him, not condoning his actions, but releasing anger that weighed her heart heavily for months. Reed provided additional critical details during his sentencing, helping authorities find other surviving victims. His cooperation secured a harsh yet humane sentence, offering redemption through truth-telling. Margaret felt peace witnessing justice served fairly, knowing Reed genuinely sought redemption. Doris reminded Margaret quietly forgiveness wasn't weakness, but strength. Margaret agreed, finally closing the painful chapter involving Reed and Charlie. The future remained challenging, but Margaret felt clarity, healing finally within reach. A year later, Lucia had blossomed remarkably, attending support groups regularly and reconnecting gently with old friendships. Margaret proudly watched Lucia grow stronger emotionally, regaining her identity slowly. One evening, Lucia nervously asked Margaret about volunteering to help other survivors, inspired by her own journey. Margaret tearfully encouraged her, amazed by Lucia's resilience and compassion. Doris, now frailer but happier, quietly smiled, proud of her granddaughter's courage. Lucia finally began reclaiming her life meaningfully, transforming tragedy into purpose. Margaret and Lucia stood quietly together on their porch one warm evening, watching the sunset. Lucia softly thanked her mother for never losing hope, for tirelessly searching, for loving fiercely despite unimaginable pain. Margaret gently squeezed Lucia's hand, fighting tears. Lucia spoke emotionally, promising she'd honor Jim's memory by living fully, courageously, and compassionately. Margaret's heart overflowed with pride, grateful their long, painful journey had finally led to healing. Together, they faced a brighter future, no longer defined by tragedy, but strength and unconditional love. As time passed, Lucia gradually rediscovered her joy in simple things. A gentle walk through familiar neighborhoods, the comforting smell of freshly baked cookies, the sound of laughter echoing through their home. Margaret watched with quiet admiration, amazed at Lucia's growing strength and determination. Doris, now older and weaker, spent her evenings softly sharing childhood memories with Lucia, rebuilding the connections stolen years ago. Each passing day, Lucia emerged more clearly, reclaiming the life that had been so cruelly taken from her. Margaret continued therapy alongside Lucia, deepening their emotional bond and helping Margaret address years of lingering trauma. The counselor gently guided Margaret to confront feelings of guilt she'd carried for decades, assuring her that the blame belonged solely with Charlie Carnes. With each session, Margaret felt a weight slowly lifting. Lucia noticed her mother's newfound sense of peace, quietly supporting her with warm smiles and gentle encouragement. Their shared healing forged a stronger family, rooted firmly in trust and unconditional love. Lucia decided to pursue a degree in psychology, motivated by her personal experiences and inspired to support others facing trauma. Margaret and Doris proudly attended her first day at college, watching Lucia step confidently into a world she once feared. As Lucia disappeared into the bustling campus, Margaret quietly wiped away tears, overwhelmed by gratitude and pride. Doris gently took Margaret's hand, whispering softly, "We did it. She's going to be okay now." Margaret nodded silently, finally feeling truly hopeful about their future. Occasionally, difficult memories resurfaced, but Lucia now faced them courageously, often openly discussing her feelings with Margaret and Doris. One afternoon, Lucia bravely asked Margaret about Jim's final moments. Margaret tearfully but honestly recounted Micah's description, emphasizing Jim's profound kindness and compassion. Lucia listened quietly, absorbing her father's bravery and generosity. She thanked Margaret softly, expressing peace knowing Jim's gentle heart had guided him until the end. Margaret knew Lucia had finally reclaimed her memories with strength and dignity. One evening, Margaret received unexpected news. Micah Carraway had peacefully passed away, leaving behind a heartfelt letter specifically for Margaret and Lucia. Reading it aloud together, Micah expressed deep remorse for not intervening sooner, apologizing profoundly. He praised Margaret's resilience, courage, and unwavering love, encouraging Lucia to live bravely. Lucia gently folded the letter, softly whispering gratitude for Micah's eventual courage. Margaret quietly honored Micah's memory, acknowledging his complicated legacy with compassion. understanding fear's paralyzing grip on good people. On a warm spring afternoon, Lucia bravely visited Jim's final resting place alongside Margaret and Doris. Quietly, Lucia placed flowers upon his grave, softly speaking words of love and gratitude. Margaret and Doris watched respectfully, allowing Lucia privacy. Lucia whispered tearfully, promising her father she'd carry forward his kindness, living a life dedicated to helping others heal. As they walked home hand in hand, Margaret felt Jim's gentle presence near them, believing he'd found peace knowing Lucia was safe and strong again. Lucia's graduation day arrived, marked by pride, excitement, and emotional reflection. Margaret watched joyfully as Lucia crossed the stage, diploma in hand, beaming confidently. Doris, sitting quietly nearby, cried tears of happiness, deeply proud of Lucia's determination and courage. After the ceremony, Lucia hugged Margaret tightly, emotionally thanking her mother for never abandoning hope. Margaret tearfully whispered her immense pride, profoundly grateful they'd reached this beautiful milestone together, transformed by resilience and love. In the years that followed, Lucia became a respected therapist, specializing in helping survivors of trauma and abuse. Margaret frequently visited Lucia's thriving practice, watching proudly as Lucia compassionately guided others toward healing. Doris, now frail yet content, spent peaceful days surrounded by her loving family, sharing stories filled with wisdom. Margaret deeply appreciated the serene stability they'd all finally achieved, grateful their once shattered lives were rebuilt through resilience, forgiveness, and unwavering love. Margaret often reflected upon their challenging journey, filled with grief, courage, and remarkable resilience. She authored a deeply moving memoir, honoring Jim's memory and courageously detailing their family's incredible story of survival and healing. Lucia supported Margaret wholeheartedly, proud her mother courageously shared their story, hoping it would inspire others facing unimaginable challenges. When the memoir published, readers responded emotionally, profoundly moved by their resilience. Margaret realized sharing their story had become a meaningful final step in their family's healing. One evening, Margaret, Lucia, and Doris gathered quietly on their porch, watching the gentle sunset together. Doris softly expressed gratitude for their incredible journey, sharing profound pride in Margaret and Lucia's extraordinary resilience and courage. Lucia thanked them both, promising continued dedication to healing and honoring Jim's legacy through compassion. Margaret, heart overflowing, felt immense gratitude for their peaceful, beautiful life, forever changed yet deeply strengthened by adversity. Together, united by love and resilience, they peacefully watched darkness fall, embracing their hopeful, extraordinary future. Lucia often found herself waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding from dreams she couldn't fully remember. Margaret would quietly enter her room, sit beside her, and stroke her hair until she calmed. Sometimes they'd talk, other times they just sat in silence, hands clasped. Margaret never asked Lucia to explain her dreams. She knew the weight of the past couldn't be rushed away. Healing wasn't linear, and though Lucia still struggled to fully connect with the world around her, she was trying, and Margaret saw it. One morning, Lucia asked if she could visit the clinic where Margaret volunteered. It was a small counseling center that helped survivors of trauma. Margaret agreed, hopeful but cautious. At the clinic, Lucia sat quietly in the waiting room, watching others come and go. After a while, she turned to Margaret and said softly, "They all look like me, not on the outside, but inside." Margaret blinked back tears. "Yes, sweetheart. That's why we keep showing up, so none of us has to feel alone anymore." Encouraged by the visit, Lucia asked to speak with one of the center's therapists, not for therapy, but just to talk. She sat across from a woman named Rachel, whose calm demeanor reminded her of Doris. They didn't talk about the farmhouse or Charlie Carnes or the years in hiding. They talked about music and how Lucia used to pretend to be a radio DJ with a toy cassette player. Rachel smiled and said, "That's still in you, you know, the part that played and imagined and dreamed." And Lucia believed her. Doris's health had begun to decline slowly. Her breathing was shorter, her steps more careful, but her spirit remained sharp. One afternoon, she handed Lucia a small envelope. Inside was a faded photo of the three of them, Lucia, Margaret, and Jim, taken at Barton Springs. Lucia stared at it for a long time. "You were so loved," Doris whispered, "even when you didn't know it, even when you couldn't feel it." Lucia nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I think I'm finally starting to feel it now." With time, Lucia began helping out at the clinic. Small tasks at first, filing papers, making tea, sitting with people who didn't want to be alone. Her presence was quiet, but comforting. Survivors often gravitated toward her, sensing that she understood in ways others couldn't. Margaret watched her daughter grow into herself, day by day. Not the girl she had been, but a woman shaped by both pain and survival. There was pride in that, not in what had happened, but in who Lucia was becoming in spite of it. One rainy afternoon, Lucia found herself alone in her room with the blue handbag, the same one that had led to everything unraveling. She opened it again, carefully inspecting its edges, seams, and that faint, heat-damaged tag. For the first time, she didn't feel fear holding it. She felt power. This object had once been used to control a narrative, to erase her identity. But now, it was evidence of her return, of her survival. She set it on her nightstand, no longer afraid of what it meant. Detective Reyes called to inform them that Charlie Carnes had officially been sentenced to life without parole. The courtroom had been packed with victims' families, survivors, and reporters. Margaret and Lucia didn't attend. They chose peace over spectacle. "His story ends there," Margaret told Lucia, "but yours doesn't." Lucia nodded. "I don't want to be remembered for what he did to me. I want to be remembered for what I did after." And from that moment, she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like the author. Lucia eventually moved into a small apartment near the clinic. It wasn't far from Margaret, who visited often. They shared dinners, watched old movies, and went on long walks. Doris, though frail, insisted on joining when she could, wrapped in a shawl and full of opinions. One night, as they sat watching a documentary on trauma recovery, Lucia turned to Margaret and said, "You know, it wasn't the rescue that saved me. It was knowing you never stopped looking. That's what brought me back." Margaret couldn't speak. She only held her. Doris passed quietly in her sleep one early spring morning. She had lived long enough to see Lucia come home, and for that, she'd said, she was at peace. The funeral was simple, private, filled with stories and tears and quiet gratitude. Lucia stood beside Margaret as they lowered Doris's casket into the ground, holding her mother's hand. "She saved me too," Lucia said. "She never gave up on either of us." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "She was the backbone of this family. Now we carry her with us." Years later, Lucia stood before a small audience at the clinic, now a licensed counselor herself. She spoke softly, but with clarity, about survival, identity, and hope. Margaret sat in the front row, tears in her eyes. Behind her, a framed photograph of Jim, Doris, and young Lucia sat on a shelf. "I used to think healing meant going back to who I was," Lucia said. "But I've learned that healing means becoming someone new, with all the love that survived the fire." The room was silent. Then came the applause. Months after her talk at the clinic, Lucia received a letter from someone she didn't know, a woman named Marin, who had heard Lucia's story through the center's newsletter, wrote about her own missing daughter, gone for 3 years with no answers. "Reading about you gave me hope," the letter said. "Hope that maybe one day she'll come back, that someone is looking." Lucia sat with the letter for hours, thinking not just about her past, but about how many others were still trapped in their own silence. Inspired, Lucia started a small support group at the clinic for families of the missing. The first meeting had only 3 attendees, but as weeks passed, more chairs filled. Some came to cry, others came to listen, and some just sat in silence, comforted by not having to explain their pain. Lucia never pushed anyone to speak. She simply offered space, something she had once longed for. Margaret often helped with refreshments, proud but quiet, watching her daughter lead with empathy rather than expertise. Lucia and Margaret were eventually invited to speak at a state symposium on trauma recovery. Margaret hesitated at first. She had never told her side publicly, but Lucia encouraged her gently. "People need to know what it's like for the ones left behind, too," she said. On stage, they sat side by side, telling their story not as victim and witness, but as a family that endured. The crowd was silent when they finished. Then came a standing ovation, not for the tragedy, but for their strength. After the symposium, a producer approached them about turning their story into a documentary. Lucia was wary. She didn't want to become a spectacle, but the team promised a careful, survivor-led narrative. After weeks of discussion, they agreed. Over several months, interviews were filmed, locations revisited, and archival material collected. When the documentary aired on public television, it received overwhelming praise, not just for the story, but for the way it was told. Quietly, honestly, and with deep respect for those who had lived it. One evening, Lucia received an email with the subject line, "I remember you." It was from a former neighbor, a girl Lucia had gone to school with before everything happened. She wrote about seeing news of the documentary and recognizing Lucia's eyes instantly. "I never forgot when you disappeared," the message said. "It changed how I looked at the world." Lucia read it twice, then responded simply, "Thank you for remembering. I'm still here. Different, but here." It was more than closure. It was connection. Years passed. The support group became a permanent fixture at the clinic. Lucia expanded it into an outreach program for teens who had aged out of foster care, another group often forgotten and silenced. She partnered with counselors, social workers, and educators to build a community of resources. "If we can help just one kid avoid getting lost," she told her team, "it's worth it." Many of the young people she met never knew her full story. They didn't need to. They just felt safe with her. Margaret grew older, her steps slower, her voice softer, but her pride in Lucia never dimmed. Every holiday, they'd set out an extra place at the table, for Jim, for Doris, and for the years they lost but never surrendered to. Sometimes Lucia would bring home someone from the clinic with nowhere else to go. "He would have done the same," she'd tell Margaret. And Margaret, smiling faintly, would say, "He'd be so proud of you." In those moments, the house felt full again. Lucia eventually wrote a book, not a memoir, but a guide for counselors working with survivors. She filled it with insights, journal entries, and small pieces of her own journey. It was used in universities and training programs across the country. She never sought attention for it, but letters still came. "Your book changed how I approach my students. This helped me reach my daughter. You helped me understand." Lucia kept them all in a wooden box beside her desk, labeled only with one word, hope. One spring morning, as Lucia walked through a quiet park, she spotted a little girl chasing bubbles while her father watched nearby. For a moment, she was pulled back in time, to red Cadillacs, sunny driveways, and promises never fulfilled. But there was no ache now, only softness. She smiled at the girl, nodded politely to the father, and kept walking. She had learned to carry her past like a photograph, not a wound, always there, but no longer tearing. Lucia never told her story to everyone she met, but for those who needed it, she shared without hesitation, not to relive the pain, but to show what survival looked like. It wasn't a perfect arc. It was a path of setbacks and small victories, of nights spent remembering and mornings spent rebuilding. But through it all, she had found peace, not in forgetting, but in choosing what to remember, and most of all, in knowing she was never really gone, just waiting to be found again.